Okay, I just wanted to finish one final association with what we talked about yesterday, that the Baal HaTanya brings a Zohar on Shir HaShirim. Now, Shir HaShirim, we know, was originally one of the most controversial books of Tanakh. There were rabbis who took the position that Shir HaShirim was love poetry between a man and a woman, and as a result, it did not belong in Kisvei HaKodesh. So some wanted to exclude it, but Rabbi Akiva was the great defender of Shir HaShirim, because Rabbi Akiva said, if all of the songs in Tanakh are holy, Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kedashim, because it represents a metaphor, it's a mashal for the passionate love that exists between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael. So the male lover is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the woman that is loved is none other than Hashem, than Bnei Yisrael, and therefore every single pasuk is not just literal, but it's understood on a deep metaphorical way. So, so many people read Shir HaShirim every Friday before Shabbos. Many read it after the Seder, because it expresses a very, very deep love. So in Shir HaShirim, in the beginning of Shir HaShirim, the woman says about her lover who is not present, he says, Mashcheni acharecha, pull me after you, meaning pull me to you, narutza, so we can run together. In other words, the simple literal meaning of the pasuk is that the woman is imagining a lover that she wants to be with who is not here, and she kind of dreams, pull me after you so I can run with you. So what the Zohar says is, Moshcheni acharecha, pull me after you, is a reference to Pesach. Narutza, so we can run together, is a reference to Shavuos. So the Baal HaTanya explains, when you are pulled, you're like a sack of potatoes. You're essentially passive. You're being pulled by the other person. So that represents Pesach, which, as we said yesterday, was an unearned gift that was given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in which we experienced revelations of godliness that were way beyond our madrega. So Moshcheni, Hashem is pulling us. We're not ready for it, but He's pulling us, ready or not. But by the time we get to Shavuos, where we worked on ourselves for the 49 levels of Sfiras HaOmer, we're no longer passively being pulled by God, but Kaviyachol, we are running with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a notion of reciprocity. Hashem gives to us, we give back to Hashem in terms of our Torah and our Ma'asim Tovim. And therefore the progression from being a passive item that is being dragged across the ground versus a notion of running with God, that is the transition between Pesach and Shavuos. Those are the two levels, and it's Sfiras HaOmer that brings us to that point by the Avodah that we engage in La'at La'at, right? So that's just finishing the thought of why Pesach is called Shabbos, you'll remember, and why Sfiras HaOmer is the day after Shabbos, because it's a new level of Avodah. It is not the Avodah of receiving godliness, it's the Avodah of internalizing the godliness within your own personality. Some want to say, people ask Akasha, in the Berachas HaShachar of the morning, every morning, we thank Hashem that He did not make us a goy. All right, it's a question of the machlekes, what a ger says. Some say a ger can also make such a bracha because this neshama was born a Jewish neshama. But putting that issue aside, people ask the question, why do we emphasize the negative? Why do we say, thank you Hashem that I wasn't made a goy? Why don't I say, thank you Hashem that you made me a Jew? Now the Ramah does bring such a shita. There are shitas that actually say, Shoasani Yisrael, or Shoasani Yehudi. But we don't paskin that way. We don't say Shoasani Yisrael. We say Sholoi Asani Goy. Same thing with the woman. Sholoi Asani Isha. We don't say Shoasani Ish. Right? So the question is, Shelo Asani Eved, all of those three brachas, Shelo Asani Eved, Shelo Asani Goy, or Nachri Summer Goris, Shelo Asani Isha. Why do you say what you're not? You ought to say what you are. Shelo Asani Yisrael. Of course, keep in mind, in some ways, if you would say it in the positive, you wouldn't be able to say three brachas. And once you say Shelo Asani Yisrael, so that already means I am a male free man. So that knocks out Goy, that knocks out Eved, knocks out Isha. In other words, it's only in the negative that you get three brachas. But so what? So who says you have to have three brachas? Say it in the positive and say one bracha. Like, what's machriach you that it has to be three brachas? So one of the answers that are given in Sifrei Chasidus is, and this is a little hard to understand, in many ways, Hashem doesn't make you a Jew. Hashem gives you the ability to become a Jew by the way you live your life. Now, I don't mean this in a halachic sense. Obviously, if a person is born a Jew, they're halachically a Jew. But spiritually, you make yourself a Jew by the decisions that you make in your life. So the most that God has given to you is, God has given you the capacity to become Jewish by his not making you the other one. I'm not a guy. Memela, I have the responsibility and the challenge and the ability to make myself a Jew. But whether you're really a Jew is up to us, up to the choices that we make in life. In fact, there's a very beautiful letter that was written by the Piazetzner Rebbe of Klonimus Kalman Shapiro. The Piazetzner Rebbe, many of you probably have heard of him, although you may not know him by that designation. He was the last Hasidic Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto who died tragically at the very end of the Warsaw Ghetto or a short time afterwards. And he was the one that was giving chizuk and inspiration in moments of the deepest darkness and suffering of the Jewish people. And the truth is, he wrote a number of Sfarim before World War II. He's not only like a Holocaust person. He wrote Chovas HaTalmidim. Again, his story is actually a very, very interesting story. He was one of the very few mechanchim who understood that modernity was a major crisis for religious kids in Poland. Meaning, kids were mainly Hasidic in Poland, but there was a lot of modernity, a lot of challenges at the beginning of the 20th century. And many kids were going off the derech. We don't realize this. Many, many kids. We think of Poland, Lithuania, as everybody was a tzaddik, and everybody was, they knew Shas at 10. There were such people, but quite a few were hemorrhaging. They were leaving Am Yisrael. The nisyonos, whether it was Zionism, whether it was communism, whether it was secular education. I wouldn't call intermarriage tended not to be a crisis in Poland. That wasn't the crisis. But leaving Shabbos, leaving Kashrus, leaving Torah was a major, major problem. And many of the mechanchim just didn't pay attention. They focused on the kids who were from, and they didn't deal with the off-the-derech population. The Piazetzner Rebbe was one of those who realized that if you want to keep children and teenagers in Yiddishkeit, you have to have a Yiddishkeit that inspires them, that awakens their emotion and their passion, and not just their intellect. And as a result, the Sefer Chovas HaTalmidim, which many of you might have picked up, but maybe you don't realize why he wrote it. He wrote it as a manual to be madrich teenagers in how to develop a relationship with Hashem on a deeply emotional level. Because he felt ultimately that would be the only way they would have the passion to remain committed. So he actually was a very visionary educator within the Hasidic world, almost a revolutionary. But the Holocaust came, and he was the main source of chizuk in the dark moments of the Warsaw Ghetto. Yeah?
Wouldn't the Piazetzner HaRav also a Rav to children?
Well, when you say Rav to children, I mean he worked with children, worked with teenagers. And in fact, in the Warsaw Ghetto itself, he would have a shalosh shudas only for children every Shabbos afternoon. And the shalosh shudas would last for 2 or 3 hours. And one of the few survivors, there weren't that many survivors, said afterwards, years later, that, we were living in the Warsaw Ghetto. People were dropping dead like flies. There was murder, there was disease, there was starvation, there was torture. Every single moment was Gehenna. But he says for those 3 hours, we were in another world. We were not living in Olam Hazeh. We were not in a concentration camp. We were not in the Warsaw Ghetto. He somehow changed the whole reality that we felt we were in Olam Haba. That's how it was described. Such an amazing thing that he changed the whole environment that we were in. Again, we can't even imagine, what life was like under those conditions. But
Shlomo Carlebach wrote The Holy Hunchback. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it. Yeah. So I know that he talked about the Piazetzner Rebbe. So you should look it up. As I say, a number of his really groundbreaking Sfarim are before the Holocaust. They weren't even connected to the Holocaust. But then, during the Holocaust, he continued to teach, and after the war, his Divrei Torah from that time were found in a milk container that was buried in the ground, and it was published as Eish Kodesh. So sometimes he's called the Eish Kodesh. And just phenomenal. It's available in English too. You could see some of what he was, an extraordinary man. But in one of his letters, now actually it wasn't a letter, it was a diary, a letter to himself. It wasn't a letter to somebody else. He's approaching Erev Rosh Hashanah in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he says, what is it that he wants to accomplish in the coming year? He was thinking about, what's my avodah? He says, to learn Torah. He says, Baruch Hashem, I learn as much Torah as I can. I know a lot of Torah. So what is it exactly? How do I want to grow? How do I want to approach? He goes through a whole thing, and he says at the end, what I want to become is, I just want to become a Jew. A Talmud Chacham, a Lamdin, I'm already that. But to become a Jew, that takes a lot of work. See, we look at it the other way. We say, being a Jew is like the low thing, and then you superimpose on top of that. I learn, I'm a Talmud Chacham, I'm a Rosh Hashiva. He's going the opposite way. He was a Talmud Chacham, he was a Rebbe, he was a Rosh Hashiva. He said, yeah, I have all that. But the one thing I'm missing is I want to be a real Jew. So it ties into what I'm saying. You can't really thank Hashem for making me a Jew because you got to make yourself a Jew. I thank Hashem that because I'm not a guy, I have the possibility of being a Jew. But I got to make that decision myself, right? And that's the Moshcheni Acharecha, Pesach. Hashem showed us what we could become. Shavuos is actually becoming it. And the Sfiras HaOmer is the graduated process that takes us la'at till we reach that level. Yeah.
What is Moshcheni Acharecha?
The words, pull me after you. The woman says to her beloved, pull me after you so I can run with you. So the Zohar says, Pesach, Hashem pulls us. Shavuos, we run with God. Right? That's the idea of passivity. Pesach is a passivity in the sense that Hashem gives you a revelation that is beyond you. Again, maybe sometime, I don't know, maybe we'll fit in some, maybe we'll learn some Piazetzner's writings or whatever. It's really an extraordinary person. The writings are very beautiful, but the personality is greater than the writings too, just knowing who he was and the chizuk that he gave. And the truth is, you see from his private diary entries that there were times that he was heartbroken. There were times that he didn't know how he could go on. But he had to go on because people needed him. Like it's something very, very moving about the notion that in all of his private misery, he had to put it aside because he had to take care of the people that needed. And he was given offers to escape, be smuggled out, etc. He turned them down. He said he has to. He's not going to abandon the people that need him, even though he possibly might have saved his own life. Who knows? That was always tricky, and the like. So Piazetzna was simply that's a little town near Warsaw. So Piazetz, he was the Rebbe Piazetz. It was never a big Hasidus, but as I say, he had quite a following because he was a very creative and innovative educator who identified problems that most of the Gedolim did not even think about. The issue of today we talk about kids at risk, but he was like one of the first ones who was noticing this hemorrhaging. In fact, that's why Beis Yaakov was started. Beis Yaakov was started because on the girls' side, a lot of girls stopped really caring about Torah and mitzvahs. So Beis Yaakov had to be started, even though historically we were not into schools for girls and everything else, because girls used to pick up their Yiddishkeit at home from their mothers. And that's why there were some who were against Sarah Schnerer inventing Beis Yaakov in the 1920s. But the Chavis Chaim and others said that, unfortunately, the home environment was not as strong as it once was, and the pressures of assimilation were very, very great, and therefore we needed to have a curriculum for girls. In fact, somebody asked Rav Shach, who did he consider to be the greatest Marbitz Torah of the 20th century? Like, who is the greatest Marbitz Torah? So which Rosh Yeshiva is he going to pick? So he said the greatest Marbitz Torah was Sarah Schnerer, who founded Beis Yaakov movement. He said she was responsible for more Yiddishkeit than any other person, because had the women not been interested in marrying B'nai Torah, then there wouldn't be any B'nai Torah at all. And therefore, she inculcated that hashkafa among the women, and that enabled there to be a Klal Yisrael of B'nai Torah. Yeah.
How did this romanticization of pre-war European Jewry begin?
Well, it kind of is a post-Holocaust situation in which, as we're mourning the Holocaust, so we remember all of the greatness that we lost, and of course there's no question that we lost a tremendous amount of greatness, but it did obscure a little bit the very severe problems that were going on. In fact, Rabbi Avigdor Miller wrote a book about the Holocaust. I don't know if you've seen it. Divine Laughter? I don't remember what it is. Divine Madness. And he actually instructed that it should not be published till he died. So it was not published in his lifetime, it was published after he died. And essentially, what he writes in the book is he writes about the tremendous assimilation. Again, intermarriage was not the problem. That's the one problem that I don't think was a European problem. But leaving Yiddishkeit, leaving Torah, that was a big, big problem. And he writes about the tremendous assimilation that was occurring in the most religious places. Poland, Lithuania, really like from places. And he basically said, had there not been a Holocaust, European Jewry would eventually become like American. It just would have become totally or largely secular. And his thesis was, based on the Tochacha, this is where it's controversial, that the Holocaust was a necessary corrective, min hashamayim. So Yidden will realize that we have to remain faithful to God. Now, this is a very hard thing to say, because people say, oh, you're blaming the victims, and you're saying, chas v'shalom, that's certainly not the case. You're not blaming anyone specific. If anything, many of the victims were the greatest tzaddikim, right? So we're not blaming the victims. But he said the Holocaust was part of a divine corrective to Klal Yisrael, because people don't realize the tremendous assimilation that was going on. So even though the percentage of from Yidden in Europe was much, much higher than America, but so you probably 2/3 were religious, but you were losing a lot. And by the time you got to World War II, the losses were literally like hemorrhaging. So as I say, most of the Mechanchim were not really involved in that much. The Piazetzner Rebbe was a visionary in trying to create structures to keep people keep kids, teenagers in particular, in the fold. And that's why much of what he writes is very relevant to people today. It is very true. I'll tell you this. People often have questions, how do I know the oral law is right? How do I know God gave the Torah at Sinai? And these are questions that are deserving of answers. But the deep fundamental truth is that when there's an emotional connection to Yiddishkeit, these questions become much less pressing. And part of why people become apikorsim is not because they have these questions on the Torah, but because the Torah is not speaking to them. They don't feel close to Hashem. They don't feel they have a relationship with God. So then the mind starts thinking about this question and that question and that question and that question, and then they don't get, definitive answers, and they go off the derech. But the reason they're really going off the derech is an emptiness in their soul. And therefore the Piasetzner saw very, very clearly that you have to have the notion of a personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then the questions may still be questions, but they're not going to destroy you. They're not going to affect you one way or the other. A person can live with a lot of questions as long as they feel a fulfillment inside. When you don't feel that fulfillment, then the questions become unbearable. Okay, it's really true. I mean, that's the old saying. It's a cliche that the Rebbitzins Cholent makes more people from than the rabbi's drasha. Essentially what it means is what makes people religious is not so much a brilliant defense of the Kuzari principle, but what makes people religious is a sense of warmth and connection and a feeling of the presence of Hashem in their lives. And then you can think about the Kuzari principle and everything else. But that's not going to make you from, and it's not going to make you unfrom. These are things you do after you sense the notion that there's something meaningful that's going on here. Now, maybe that's an anti-intellectual approach, but I think it's true, and I think the Piasetzner clearly thinks it's true, because if you look at the Chovas HaTalmidim, you will see that the whole book is not about proving Torah min hashamayim or proving anything. It's about how to feel the presence of Hashem in your life. Now again, one might say, well, okay, he was a chassid. That's what chassidim do. Okay, that's true. He was coming at it from the aspect of chassidus. But I think many, many people today who are not chassidim officially find that approach resonates with them in a very, very deep way. Whether it's Shlomo Karlbach, Neo Chassid, whether it's Rav Moshe Weinberger today, it's called Neo Chassidus. Neo Chassidus is basically people who are not officially part of any Hasidic group, but they want to learn ideas of Hasidus and they want to be connected to those ideas. So it's a popular thing. It's a popular thing, and there's a good reason why it's a popular thing, because I think it feeds a lot of people something in their diet that they have to have. Okay. So that's kind of the end of that subject. Okay, I'm sorry to carry things over like this. New subject. We have 2 days. We have today and tomorrow. So I just want to talk a little bit about Megillas Rus, right? A book of the Tanakh, a beautiful book, Megillas Rus. Only 4 chapters in Eretz Yisrael, because we only have 1 day of Yom Tov. We do Megillas Rus on the first day. Chutz La'aretz be the second day. So it'll be at the early morning minyan. So you might fall asleep during Megillas Rus, which would be a pity. Megillas Rus, the author of Megillas Rus was none other than the Navi Shmuel HaNavi. And the question is, well, really 2 questions. Why did he write Megillas Rus? And question 2 is, why do we read Rus on Shavuos? Now, please understand that these are 2 very different reasons. Why Megillas Rus was written in the first place and why we read it on Shavuos are 2 separate issues. So let's focus on the chronologically first problem. Why did Shmuel HaNavi write Megillas Rus? So the basic answer that the Meforshim give us is that Shmuel HaNavi was the one who anointed David HaMelech in the lifetime of Shaul. And Shmuel died before Shaul died, and David did not become king in the lifetime of Shmuel. But one of Shmuel's last deeds was he wanted to legitimate the lineage of David HaMelech so that nobody would cast aspersions on his entitlement to be king. Let's explain what the problem is. The problem is that David HaMelech is a great-grandson of Rus. Right? Rus married Boaz. They had a son, Oved. Oved had a son, Yishai. Yishai had a son, David. In fact, that's the last pasuk in Megillas Rus. So David HaMelech is a great-grandson of Rus. Rus is a Moabite convert. Now the Torah says beferish in Parshas Ki Seitzei that neither the Ammoni, the Ammonite, or the Moabite cannot enter the congregation of God. That means they're not allowed to enter the Jewish people by marriage. They can convert, but they cannot marry into the Jewish people. Remember Ammon and Moav. Ammon and Moav are descended from Lot's daughters. After Sodom was destroyed, Lot's daughters got him drunk, and the older daughter fornicated with him and had a child that she called Moab, from my father. And the next night, the younger daughter did the same thing and had a child she called Ammon, from my people. And they became the progenitors, the ancestors of the nations of Ammon and Moab that lived east of the Yarden, in the land that was not occupied by Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe. And the Torah says that although we're not allowed to wage war against Ammon and Moab, but they're not allowed to enter the congregation of God. Now, why is that so? So it's interesting. It's not because of the incest. The Torah does not say they cannot enter the congregation of God because of the disgusting way they were generated. That's not the reason. The reason is because when we were coming to Eretz Yisrael from the desert, we wanted to pass through the land of Ammon and Moab, and we asked them for food and water that we would pay for. And they refused to give us food and water. They were cruel, even though we were willing to pay. And they didn't have hakaras hatov for everything that Avraham did for Lot. And because of their cruelty, their selfishness, their tsorus ayin, and their lack of hakaras hatov, the Torah says we don't even allow them to enter into the Jewish people by virtue of marriage, because being a Jew by definition means you're grateful and you're compassionate and you have rachamim. And a nation that does not exhibit those qualities cannot enter the Kahal Hashem. So, David HaMelech, throughout his life, had many, many enemies within the Jewish people. Supporters of Shaul or whatever it is, who constantly tried to sometimes physically kill him, but at the very least, they tried to minimize or disparage his qualifications for Malchus. So one of the arguments that surfaced and resurfaced again and again and again is David HaMelech cannot be king. His lineage is tainted because he comes from the accursed Moabite people, where the Torah says they cannot enter the congregation of God. So an albatross, so to speak, that David HaMelech constantly had to deal with was the accusation, actually it's a true statement, that he is from the Moabites. Now, halachically, what is our answer? Halachically, our answer is very interesting, that the Torah only prohibits male Moabites from entering into the congregation of God, but female Moabites are permitted. And since David is descended from a female Moabite who converted, even though David's a male, but he's descended from the female Moabite, he's going to be kosher. And the Gemara explains the reason why the female Moabite is permitted is because the Torah condemns the Moabites because they didn't give us food and water. Only the men could be expected to bring food and water to a nation that's going, a strange nation. The women could not be expected to do that, therefore they're not condemned. So the thing is this, for various reasons that hopefully we'll get into, this halacha gets constantly forgotten, meaning people keep on thinking, if you're from David's enemies are trying to paint the other story. If you're from a Moabite, you're no good, no matter what. And therefore, throughout David's life, they're still bringing up He's not even a kosher Jew because he's from the Moabite woman. So, Shmuel Hanavi wanted to write the story of how Rus is indeed a Moabite convert. And he talks about, number one, her sincerity, her righteousness. But number two, the fact that Boaz was one of the shoftim, one of the judges. Boaz was the Gadol Hador. So Shmuel wanted to memorialize that Rus's acceptance into Klal Yisrael was by the Gadol Hador of the time. And therefore, that will put to rest any accusation that Rus's entry into Klal Yisrael was illegitimate. And therefore, it puts to rest any allegation that David HaMelech is puzzled because he comes from Rus. In other words, the book of Megillas Rus was quite literally written to remove any question regarding the legitimacy of David HaMelech as a king by showing that Rus's marriage was to the Gadol Hador, Boaz. That is why Shmuel wrote it, because Shmuel died before David became king, but Shmuel anticipated that this Moabite thing is going to continue to be a problem, as it was even after he wrote Megillas Rus. Now, this explains a very fascinating thing. It explains why Shmuel eliminates a certain detail that Chazal say that happened. When Rus was married by Boaz, right, Boaz married Rus at the end of Megillas Esther. Boaz is the Gadol Hador. And they consummated the marriage, and Rus got pregnant, right? Oved, Yishai, David. Chazal say that Boaz died the next day. He consummated his marriage with Rus, and Boaz died. That detail is not in Megillas Rus. Now you understand why. I mean, here we have a person who's marrying a Moabite woman, and many people think you're not allowed to marry a Moabite woman. But Boaz paskins, it's okay. He's Gadol Hador. He marries the Moabite woman, he drops dead the next day. What are people going to say, especially those who don't like David? You see, we're right. Now, the truth is, the opposite was the case. Boaz was very old. Boaz should have died already. God kept him alive so he could have that union with Rus that would perpetuate Malchus Beis David. But since that would be so misunderstood, Shmuel Hanavi didn't put it in. Yeah.
I have two questions about the Svara of Moabite, not Moabites.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it not reconsidered after the incident at Shittim? Because many of the women, if not all of them, were Moabite Christians.
Yep.
And also, if we're worried about their cruelty, then women who grew up in Moab would be teaching our children. So are we not concerned of cruelty being taught that way?
Yes. So in terms of the first question, that's a very excellent question. All of a sudden, when it comes to hospitality, all of a sudden the Moabite women become sanua, meaning like this. They said, "Oh, you can't blame me." I mean, a woman says, "You expect me to offer water to an Israelite people? It's not sneas for me to talk to a strange man." And they get credit for that. You're right. Now, the question is, when it comes to being machshel them in Aveira, the Moabite women were perfectly happy to have intercourse with them, right? It says that was, so what's the shot? You pull out the tznius card when it comes to hospitality, but when it comes to being mazana and being machshel them, no problem. So obviously it's impossible to say that the motivation of the Moabite women was tznius. It certainly wasn't tznius. But here I think you see a very interesting little lesson, and the lesson here is, if you do the right thing even for the wrong reasons, you get credit for it. Meaning it was a tsanua thing not to go out. That wasn't their motivation? Okay, but they still get credit for it. We sometimes say, I don't want to do a certain mitzvah because I would be a hypocrite. It's not what I really feel. But sometimes saying, be a hypocrite. It's okay to be a hypocrite because at least you're doing the right thing. Alexander Pope, I think, said, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, meaning I'm a hypocrite, but at least I'm acknowledging there's a certain standard of behavior. So your first point is a very good point. Your second point is an interesting issue, and that is if there is cruelty here, then when you're bringing in the Moabite women and they will become mothers, again, these are Moabite women who convert, obviously. We're not talking about intermarriage. And so the question is going to be that they may inculcate some of those Moabite values or absence of values into the Jewish people, and that can be very destructive. Well, again, our assumption would be that the Moabite woman, at least, who adopts Klal Yisrael, will herself be elevated from those taints, just as Rus herself. Rus is, among other things, the one thing that emerges from the Megillah itself is Rus was a paragon of kindness. So you see clearly that she was above all of those taints. Now, so this is really a single answer. Why was the book of Rus written? To legitimate the yichus of David HaMelech, to pave the way for Malchus Beis David. Now you understand why that's so important. It's not only important because of David, it's important because ultimately this is the Messianic line. Do not forget this. The Messianic line comes from Rus, because Rus is the great-grandmother of David, and David is the ancestor of Mashiach. Now, we then have a second question. Okay, why do we read Rus on the holiday of Shavuos? Now, the makor of reading Rus on the holiday of Shavuos, it's not like Megillas Esther. Megillas Esther is mamash a chiyuv. Rus is a getter of a minhag. In fact, in Chutz La'aretz, as you know, we don't even make a bracha. We don't make a bracha on reading Megillas Rus because it's only a getter of a minhag. In Eretz Yisrael, based on the minhag HaGra, the Gra says to make a bracha because he says that this is a minhag that became an obligation. So that's why they make a bracha. That's why they read it from a klaf, right? And Chutz La'aretz, most places, no bracha, and they read it from a chumash. Here, at least those who follow the minhag of the Gra, we read it from a klaf and we make a bracha. But the makor, either way, is Maseches Seifrim. Maseches Seifrim is not a regular, it's called the small Maseches. These are printed in the Shasin after Maseches Avodah Zarah. And Maseches Seifrim is really from the time of the Gaonim, and it is various ritual laws, how to write a Sefer Torah, different minhagim. Many minhagim have their sources from Maseches Seifrim. Now, Maseches Seifrim itself doesn't give a reason. It just says, our minhag is Rus on Shavuot, Shir Hashirim on Pesach, Koheles on Sukkot, Eicha on Tisha B'Av, but it doesn't, Eicha is self-evident, but it doesn't give you a reason. So there are a lot of different reasons why we read Rus on Shavuos that the Sforim give us. One reason is that Matan Torah is when we said Na'aseh v'Nishma, we accepted the mitzvahs. And according to Chazal, all of us became Gerim. We converted, right? So we read the story of a Geirus L'Shem Shamayim, so we should understand what it means to commit, what it means to commit to God. Because remember, Rus was a princess. Rus was a queen. And she came to Yiddishkeit impoverished, without any family connections. So poor that she had to kind of beg in the fields. But she was so devoted to Hashem, to Torah, to Naomi, that she said, I'll give up everything. So we read Rus because as we are accepting the Torah, we have to look to her as the role model for sincerity and commitment. I think that is probably the basic reason. The other reason is that according to Chazal, David HaMelech's Yortzeit is on Shavuos. He died on Shavuos. Therefore, we read the story of the lineage of David HaMelech on Shavuos. And a third reason, the Medrash says, is that Rus merited to be the mother or the ancestor of Malchus in the merit of the kindness and the chesed that she showed Naomi. And since all of our accomplishments in Torah will come only through the midah of chesed, so we want to emphasize the greatness of chesed, right? So these are the three basic reasons to understand the sincerity of a gerus, to commemorate the yahrzeit of David HaMelech, and to remember the sechar of Gemilos, Chasadim, because that is what gave Rus all of the merit that Rus had, right? So that's why we read it on Shavuos. Again, very beautiful sefer. And so I guess tomorrow we'll discuss a little bit some aspects of Rus, at least in a selective way. I'll throw out one question you can think about. Maybe you've already thought about it. That is, the beginning of Rus talks about Elimelech, Naomi, and their two boys moving to Moab because of a famine in Eretz Yisrael. And it mentions that the two boys, I mean, they're men, Machlon and Chilyon, married Moabite women. Machlon marries Rus, and Chilyon marries Orpah. And what happens is Machlon and Chilyon both die, and Elimelech dies as well, leaving Naomi with her two daughters-in-law. And then she decides to return back to Eretz Yisrael. So one interesting question is this. Did Machlon and Chilyon marry Goyim? Meaning, the conversion of Rus seems to occur after they return to Eretz Yisrael. That actually means Machlon and Chilyon married unconverted non-Jewish women. Now again, let me make an obvious point. The whole discussion I had a few minutes ago about marrying a female Moabite is talking about a Moabite who converts. We're not talking about marrying a guy. That you can't do. So one of the very, very difficult interpretive questions in Megillas Rus is, did Machlon and Chilyon marry women who converted, or did they marry women who didn't convert? And if they did so, how could they marry non-Jewish women? Do we simply assume that they sinned in that very serious way? And as I'll go through the different parts of the Megillah, you will actually see there seems to be a big contradiction. There are sources in the Megillah that indicates they were Goyim at the time of the marriage, and there are other sources that indicates they already were converted. So we'll go through some of that question tomorrow. Yeah.
Why would Elimelech die as well if his sons married women?
Well, we'll see. There are other reasons why Elimelech was punished for leaving Eretz Yisrael. Now, I'm not suggesting he was punished for that reason. I'm not even suggesting they were punished for that reason. We'll discuss why they died. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow.